Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss personality. To be honest, it doesn't matter which lecture or unit you read first for this course. I just thought it would be better to kind of um, talk about ourself and the identity first as a foundation and then build on looking at different personality theories and how we come to that understanding of ourselves using those fundamental blocks like traits and roles and different things of that nature. So for this section, we're going to talk about personality, and I'm going to expand a little bit beyond our text, and I've included the resources that I've used for further reading in case you are interested, because our text focuses mostly on trait theories, but there are so many other theories of personality that we can look at, and so I'm just going to mention a few. I won't keep this too long, but I did want to mention them because they're very important, like Freud, of course, and Erikson, but we'll get there. And so for this unit, I want to look at our learning objectives. Looking at the Big Five personality tests, this is one of the most heavily researched personality tests, so we're going to examine that. We're also going to look at personality traits and how that has developed as a concept. How personality can be manifested in our everyday behavior, which is going to be kind of relative to the discussion board question I've asked you. Looking at examples and descriptions of the Big Five personality traits. I have a nice illustration for you to reference in case you need it. And describe social learning and how that kind of influences the traits we have, and how these traits manifest themselves. Are they as consistent as we would like to believe? That's one of the questions we're going to look at. So personality traits. As we talked about previously, traits are just going to be patterns in characteristics of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. What we're looking for is consistency and stability. So in different scenarios, maybe if you are an agreeable type of person, right, you kind of go with the flow, will we see that manifest itself in an array of situations? Whether it's agreeing with a coworker on where you want to go to eat, or agreeing with your friends that you're going to watch the Tiger King Netflix special and burn some brain cells, right? Consistency. Do you act in a similar fashion in a variety of scenarios? And stability. Usually personality traits are going to be stable over time. Traits that we're going to see manifest themselves when you're 20 years old may also be prevalent when you're 30 or 40. And now when we talk about personality traits, I want you to think of the traits that you would use to describe yourself. Maybe you think, oh, well, I'm smart, I'm hardworking, I'm open-minded, I'm traditional, right? There are so many different traits we can use to describe ourselves. And those different traits are going to influence how we behave and think in certain situations. Well, when we look at personality traits as we move through this lesson, you're going to see that we've had to narrow some of these traits, because if we used all the words to describe people and tried to find systematic studies looking at all those words, it would be a lot of data to work with and probably not that efficient. But when we talk about traits, I do want you to think of them as dimensions. Okay, and what I mean by that is think of them as a spectrum. We don't want to think, okay, here's a common one I see a lot, and I put a meme in this slideshow for your reference. When people say, I'm an extrovert or an introvert. Well, really, introversion, extroversion is a dimension on the same spectrum. We're not looking at two different people entirely or categorizations entirely. We're looking at where someone falls on that dimension, because most people tend to fall probably somewhere in the middle. So try not to think of them as if you are one trait, you are absent of the other. Think of them as being, well, I'm more extroverted than introverted, for example. And we're also going to address some criticisms of trait theories. So is there really consistency? Do people act similarly? Or with social learning, will we be influenced by very specific situations to act differently. For example, a cheating example on an exam. Someone who is very honest, maybe they would be pressed to be dishonest and cheat on an exam depending on the social circumstance. But we'll get there. And so in this introduction, we want to look at personality. Personality, as we're going to use it, is just the characteristic ways that people differ from one another. And we're going to look at those differences in traits. Now, Gordon Allport was the first psychologist or trait theorist who wanted to look at how we can observe those differences in people and how they think, how they behave, etc. And so he thought we best understood individuals by those personality traits and the dimensions on which they differ. So for an example here, I have included this image that's from your text. We're looking at the number of people at each level. So we have levels of extroversion. So low, medium, and high. So think of that as a continuum. So that continuous distribution, right? You see how it kind of returns to a bell curve here, right? There's more towards the middle and the norm. That's what I was talking about previously. Well, what Allport did was he used what he called the lexical hypothesis, and that has to do with our lexicon or the language that we use. And he scanned the dictionary for all words that could potentially define personalities. And he came up with 18,000 words. Or traits. I think you and I both can agree that's a bit excessive. And so what they did later is they conducted a factorial analysis to see which words were closely associated. That's a whole statistical method that I'm not going to explain right now. But it's if you are interested, let me know because I can't explain it. But it's talking about which words are heavily associated with one another. So for example, if you are extroverted, you tend to also be gregarious or very social. So those kind of traits occur together. And so what you're doing by looking at what traits occur together, kind of seeing which trait could absorb the others, like trying to eliminate some of that redundancy in examining the traits. So this way we can describe people more efficiently. This was just a funny meme that I saw because we talk consistently. I feel like introvert memes are a huge thing, but when you're trying to love people but you're also an introvert and have boundaries. Anyway, just to illustrate the point that, in common language, we kind of have this idea that people are either introverted or extroverted as opposed to being more extroverted than introverted. So with personality traits, they're going to be consistent, stable, and be different amongst different individuals. So that consistency again, if someone is talkative, right? Let's say they are just a talkative person. My husband is a very talkative person. I'm going to use him as an example. He's in the other room. I don't know if he can hear me. He's a very talkative person. He is talkative whether you are chatting up an 80-year-old woman at the grocery store or a 5-year-old kid who asks him a question. So in those different scenarios, he's across situations, this trait is going to be prevalent. It's going to be prominent. And it's stable over time. Since I've known him for 13 years, right? He has always been this way. And so that's what we're seeing with these personality traits. Now maybe think of something in yourself. Maybe there's something that has changed. That is possible too. But more often than not, we see a stability in different traits. Maybe they've changed a little bit, but they're generally stable. And there's going to be individual differences. Now, with being talkative, you may say, how are there individual differences? Everyone knows how to talk, right? True. But some people are going to talk more than others. So maybe next to him, I look like I don't talk a lot, which y'all who watch these videos are probably like, you talk a lot, right? So, there's going to be comparative individual differences in those traits. And that's how we're trying to differentiate people and understand their personalities, what makes them different. Now, the 5-factor model of personality. It can be abbreviated, or it may help you to remember it with the acronym OCEAN. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So these are what is believed to be the big five, meaning that all personality traits can fall within these very broad traits. So openness is your imagination, feelings, actions, ideas. This is kind of like your willingness to engage in new tasks. So as you'll see here on the left, if you score low on a different trait, they're going to show kind of what type of behaviors you may exhibit. Whereas if you score high, it'll show what kind of behaviors you may have if you score high. So with openness, if you score high on openness, you may be very curious, have a wide range of interests, and very independent, right? You may navigate new scenarios openly. You may be welcoming to new experiences. Whereas if you have a low score on openness, you may be very practical, conventional, and prefer a routine. So you see there's a lot of differences, and there's a lot of inferences we can draw from these different traits. But one thing that's important to remember, I won't go through all of them because you can read them on the slide in your own time. But one thing to remember is that if you score high on one trait, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to score high on another. The associations, they're very delineated, right? The associations we have here, we can't say, oh, well, if someone scores high on openness, they're going to score high on extroversion. No, that's not how it works, right? We just think they're going to be kind of individually assessed within one giant personality assessment. And again, if you want to know more about, how that works statistically, let me know and I can send you a resource to read on it. But just know that openness is just like your openness to new experiences. Conscientiousness is just your self-discipline. So think of how conscious you are, hardworking about meeting deadlines, for example, or being conscientious of how you go about doing things. Extroversion is that sociability aspect we talk about. Agreeableness, how cooperative you are, kind of like do you go with the flow with people? Are you helpful, trusting, or do you tend to be more solo in your working? Are you more critical of others? And neuroticism is just your tendency towards unstable emotions. That's important to remember because that one sometimes always, when I look at this, jumps out at me as a bit different than the rest. So this is just talking about like your level of anxiousness, unhappiness, how often you're prone to negative emotions as opposed to calm, even-tempered, and secure here on the low end of the score. Anyway, that's the 5-factor model of personality, and that is one of the ones that has had, one of the personality assessments that has had the most research conducted on it. Now, why do we study traits? So why do we look at these patterns in people's thinking and behaviors? Well, they tend to have broad-ranging consequences for everyday life. So for an example we use in our text, success in college may be predicted by these different traits. We may be able to predict certain behaviors. But keep in mind these are going to be general behaviors, not behaviors in a specific scenario. So when we say predictability, these are things like someone who rates high on conscientiousness may have higher success in college than someone who rates low on conscientiousness because they're used to what? Being competent, self-disciplined, thoughtful, and goal-driven, right? They may be internally motivated, externally motivated, but either way, they're committed to being conscientious about their work and doing things on time, and it's very self-driven. So those kind of traits can predict certain behaviors as an indicator of success. This is something industrial organizational psychologists look at in their personality assessments, trying to find a lot of reliability and validity in these tests because sometimes they will base personality assessments as part of an occupational or employment package. Sometimes you may have taken something of the sort when applying for a job because they want to look at what type of traits may be beneficial in what type of domain. So that's what we're looking for with why we study traits, because we want to look at kind of the certain level of predictability that comes with it and understanding different people's characteristics. I'm going to pause the video here and we'll leave off with part 2.